Hey guys, and welcome back. Tonight we're stepping into one of those small, quiet corners of 1950s American life that people rarely talk about, but almost everyone who lived through it remembers. The moment a housewife heard a car pull into the driveway and knew, without even looking, that guests had arrived. Before we get into it, I want to say a genuine thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. You always seem to notice the small human details that make these evenings worth exploring, and this channel is better for it. If you're new here, consider sticking around, and if this kind of thing is your speed, a like or a comment always helps more than you would think. And if you would rather listen than watch, we're now on Spotify too, the link is in the description, so you can carry these evenings with you wherever you go. Now go ahead and get settled. Dim the lights if you can. Put on a fan for that soft, steady hum. Pull the blanket up. Tonight is not about staying alert, it is about drifting somewhere warm and familiar. Because tonight we're asking some quiet questions. What did it actually feel like to hear the doorbell ring on a Friday evening in 1955? What did the good tablecloth smell like when it came out of the cedar chest? What did it sound like when the coffee percolator started up in the kitchen, just as the first guest stepped through the door? What did a housewife actually think about standing in her hallway, straightening a picture frame for the third time, waiting? And just like that, it is 1955. The porch light is already on. Somewhere down the street, a car door closes, and in your kitchen, the good dishes are already out, waiting for the evening to begin. Let's start 2 full days before the guests ever arrive, because for you, having company over never actually begins at the front door. It begins on Wednesday morning, standing in your kitchen in your housecoat, mentally walking through every room of the house, as though you're seeing it through someone else's eyes for the first time in months. You pour your coffee and let it sit a moment, cooling in the cup while you look around at a kitchen that, until this instant, seemed perfectly fine. Now, suddenly you notice the small things. The curtain that has faded slightly where the afternoon sun hits it. The scuff mark near the baseboard that never quite came out. The chair in the corner that wobbles just enough to be noticeable if someone leans the wrong way. None of it mattered yesterday. All of it matters today. This is the strange arithmetic of hosting. A house that felt entirely adequate for your own family suddenly needs to be reconsidered for the eyes of others. It is not vanity, not exactly. It is something closer to care, the same instinct that makes you want the people you invite in to feel that thought went into the evening before they ever crossed the threshold. You walk from room to room with your coffee cooling further, making a mental note of everything that needs attention. The living room rug could use a good beating out on the line. The good towels are folded in the hall closet, but you will want to press them again before Friday. The ashtrays need washing, even the ones that have not been used since the last time you had people over. There is a particular smell that settles into a house over weeks of ordinary living. Nothing unpleasant, just the smell of everyday life, and you find yourself wanting it replaced, at least for one evening, with something crisper. Outside your kitchen window, the neighbourhood is waking up in its usual unhurried way. Someone's screen door bangs twice down the block. A milk truck idles at the corner before moving on to the next house. None of it is for you, none of it knows what your Wednesday holds, and there is something almost comforting in that. The world continues at its regular pace while your own private countdown quietly begins. You set your coffee down and go to the hall closet, pulling out the vacuum cleaner with the particular resolve of someone starting a project they know will take 2 full days rather than 1. The vacuum's low hum fills the living room, that steady mechanical drone that will become by Friday evening a smell rather than a sound, mixed in with floor wax and the beginnings of something baking. There is a kind of quiet pleasure in this early stage, even amid the work of it. You're not yet tired. The nervousness that will arrive Friday afternoon has not yet found you. Right now it is simply Wednesday, and you have 2 days and a plan slowly forming in your mind of how the rooms will look, how the table will be set, what you will serve and in what order. You think briefly of your own mother doing this same walk through her house, decades before you were old enough to understand what she was doing or why it mattered so much to her. You remember watching her stand in doorways, arms crossed, appraising a room the way you are appraising this one now. It did not make sense to you then. It makes perfect sense to you now, standing in your own front hall in your housecoat. Coffee gone lukewarm on the side table. By mid-morning you have made your rounds. You know which room needs what. You know the order you will tackle things in. Dusting before vacuuming. Curtains before rugs. The kitchen last, because the kitchen always undoes itself again before you're finished with everything else. It is the kind of quiet, private planning that no one but you will ever fully see the evidence of. Your guests will simply walk into a home that feels warm and cared for. They will not know about the scuff mark you spent 10 minutes on, or the chair leg you finally tightened with a bit of wood glue, or the curtain you decided in the end to simply leave faded because there was no time left to replace it. That is the quiet work of a housewife in 1955, the invisible architecture behind an evening that will look by Friday entirely effortless. No one arriving at your door will ever count the hours between now and then. They will only feel the results, a house that seems to have been waiting for them all along. You rinse your coffee cup, set it in the drying rack and glance once more around the kitchen. 2 days. You already know exactly where to begin. It is Wednesday afternoon now, and there is a list on your kitchen counter written in pencil, already half covered in small check marks. This is the kind of list that exists nowhere else, but in your own handwriting, in your own particular shorthand, understood by no one but you. The paper itself is nothing special, torn from the pad your husband keeps by the telephone for messages, but by the time you're finished with it, it will have become something like a small map of the entire week. Roast, underlined twice. Rolls from the bakery, not the box kind. Candles, check the drawer first. Ice, more than you think you'll need. Each item sits beside a small pencil mark, some checked already, most still waiting. You glance at it now and then throughout the afternoon, the way you might check a clock, not because you have forgotten what it says, but because seeing it there, slowly filling with check marks, gives you a small and steady sense of progress. There is something deeply satisfying about crossing an item off a list. It is one of the few tasks in a housewife's week that offers this particular kind of visible proof, a line drawn through a word, evidence that something has in fact been accomplished. The list grows as the day goes on. You add things you forgot the first time around. Butter, in case the rolls need it. Extra napkins, the cloth ones from the hutch. A note to yourself, small and almost illegible, reminding you to iron the tablecloth again on Friday morning, even though you already know you will do this regardless of whether you write it down. There is a rhythm to writing a list like this, one that feels almost meditative once you settle into it. You stand at the counter, pencil in hand, staring past the paper for a moment, as you picture the evening in your mind, walking through it course by course, room by room. What will they see when they first walk in? What will they smell from the kitchen? What will be on the table when they sit down? The list becomes, in a strange way, a script for an evening that has not yet happened. One you are already directing scene by scene from your kitchen counter on a Wednesday afternoon. Your daughter wanders in at one point, peers over your shoulder, and asks what half the words mean. You explain patiently, pointing out that rolls, bakery, not the box kind, means precisely what it says, and that this distinction matters more than she currently understands. She nods, unconvinced, and wanders back outside. You smile faintly and return to your list. It is the kind of a list that would mean nothing to anyone else who found it. A stranger glancing at this paper would see only fragments, half words and abbreviations, no context at all. But to you, every line carries an entire small story. Candles means the ones from your wedding china cabinet, the ones you save for exactly these occasions. Ice means the extra trip to the ice house your husband will need to make Friday morning, something you will remind him of twice just to be sure. By late afternoon, the list has become long enough that it spills onto a second sheet, taped just beneath the first. You do not mind. If washing each piece before use is its own small ritual. You fill the sink carefully, testing the water temperature twice, because this china cannot handle anything too hot or too cold without protest. You wash each plate by hand, drying it immediately with a good towel kept specifically for this purpose, watching the gold rim gleam faintly under the kitchen light as you set it aside to join the others. Your mother gave you this set the year you married, wrapped carefully in newspaper inside a box far too heavy for its size. You remember unwrapping each piece slowly at your own kitchen table, your new husband standing nearby, both of you still getting used to the idea that this was now your home, your dishes, your life to build. She had told you, handing over the box, that these were for special occasions only, and you had nodded, not quite understanding yet how rare special occasions would actually turn out to be in the middle of ordinary married life. Now, years later, standing at your dining room table with 8 place settings gleaming in front of you, you understand her advice completely. This china has seen your daughter's christening, 2 anniversaries, a handful of dinner parties much like the one you are now preparing for. Each occasion has left its own quiet mark on your memory, even if the plates themselves show no sign of the years passing. You count the settings twice, just to be sure, then begin arranging them in the china cabinet in the exact order you will need them Friday evening, plates on top, cups and saucers just below, the gravy boat with its small crack tucked carefully toward the back where it will not be the first thing anyone reaches for. Closing the hutch door, you hear that same familiar creak, quieter this time, almost like the house exhaling. The china sits waiting now, patient behind its glass, ready for Friday. You glance at it once more before leaving the room, feeling for just a moment the quiet weight of everything this small set of dishes has carried through your years in this house. It is Thursday evening now, and the whole house smells like lemon oil and floor wax, a scent that will cling faintly to the curtains for days after the guests have gone home, and life has quietly returned to normal. You move through the living room with your cloth in hand, working the wax into the wood of the side table in slow, even circles, watching the surface catch the lamplight as it begins to shine. This is one of those tasks that rewards patience, the kind of work that shows its results only gradually, one small section at a time, until an entire tabletop gleams where it was merely dull an hour before. The smell itself has become, over the years, something you associate less with cleaning and more with anticipation. It is the smell of company coming. Your daughter, passing through the hallway, wrinkles her nose slightly and asks why everything smells so strong tonight, and you tell her, simply, that this is what a house smells like when it's getting ready for something special. She does not fully understand yet, but she will, someday, when she is standing in her own living room doing this same work for her own family. You move next to the wood floor in the front hall, getting down on your knees with the wax and a soft cloth, working it into the boards in long, careful strokes. The floor has seen years of foot traffic, scuffed in places from your husband's work shoes, from your daughter's roller skates on the one occasion you allowed them indoors, from ordinary life simply happening across its surface day after day. Tonight, though, it begins to shine again, catching the hallway light in a way that makes the whole house feel suddenly more solemn, more prepared. The lemon oil comes next, worked into the dining table and the arms of the good chairs, the ones that will hold your guests tomorrow evening. You breathe in the sharp, clean scent of it as you work, letting it settle into the wood grain, imagining, as you always do, the moment tomorrow when someone will run a hand along this same table and comment, without quite knowing why, on how well kept everything feels. There is something almost meditative about this particular evening of cleaning. Unlike the earlier work of the week, the list making and the menu planning, this is simple, physical, repetitive work. The kind that lets your mind wander even as your hands stay busy. You think about tomorrow evening as you polish, picturing where everyone will sit, what the room will look like once the lamps are lit and the good tablecloth is spread, how the whole house will smell tomorrow when this same lemon oil scent mingles with roasting meat and fresh coffee. Your husband comes home partway through the evening, pausing in the doorway to take in the smell before he has even said hello. "Smells like something's happening around here," he says, and you tell him, "Yes, something is, tomorrow evening," and he nods, already remembering, already glancing toward the dining room where the good china waits behind glass. By the time you finish, the whole downstairs carries that same clean, waxed scent, deep and slightly citrus, mixed faintly with the wood polish still drying on the side tables. You stand for a moment in the middle of the living room, looking around at a house that feels, for tonight at least, entirely transformed from its ordinary self. It is the kind of transformation that will not last, of course. By next week, the ordinary smells of daily living will have returned. The wax and lemon oil faded back into whatever household scent has settled in over years of normal use. But tonight, standing here in the lamplight with your cloth still in hand, the house feels ready. Tomorrow your guests will walk into this same clean scent, and though they will likely never comment on it directly, some part of them will feel, without quite knowing why, that they have been expected, that care has gone into every corner of this evening before it even begins. You set your rags aside at last, wash the lemon oil from your hands at the kitchen sink, and glance once more around the gleaming rooms. Tomorrow, everything will be ready. Let's move to the dining room table, set a full day ahead of time, because in your house, nothing about tomorrow evening is left to chance. The tablecloth is pressed so flat it looks as though it has never once been folded. You smooth your palm across its surface one more time, checking for any stray wrinkle the iron might have missed, though you already know there are none. This cloth has been in your family for years, brought out only for occasions exactly like this one, and pressing it correctly has become, over time, its own small point of pride. You begin placing the good china at each setting, moving slowly around the table, checking the spacing between plates with something close to precision, though no one arriving tomorrow will ever measure it the way you're measuring it now. The silverware follows, each fork and knife set at the same careful angle, polished earlier in the week until it caught the light exactly the way you wanted. Setting the table this far ahead of time is not, strictly speaking, necessary. You could easily manage it tomorrow afternoon in a fraction of the time, but there is something calming about doing it tonight instead, something that lets you sit with the finished result for a full day before anyone actually arrives to see it. You walk around the table once it is finished, adjusting a water glass here, straightening a napkin there, seeing the room the way your guest will see it tomorrow evening, though for now it sits empty, waiting. The candles come next, the ones from the china cabinet saved for exactly these evenings. You set them carefully in their holders, not yet lighting them, simply placing them where they will sit tomorrow when the room grows dim and the real evening begins. Even unlit, they seem to change the character of the table, suggesting the kind of evening that is coming without yet delivering it. Your daughter wanders through as you finish, running a small finger along the edge of a folded napkin before you gently swat her hand away with a smile. Not yet, you tell her. Tomorrow. She nods and wanders off again, already losing interest, though you notice her glance back once more from the doorway, before disappearing down the hall. You stand alone in the dining room for a moment once everything's finished, looking at the table the way you might look at a finished painting, checking for anything out of place. The gold rims of the china catch the last of the evening light coming through the window. The silverware gleams. The folded napkins sit at careful angles beside each plate, waiting. There is a particular kind of quiet satisfaction in a table, set a full day early, sitting untouched and ready in an otherwise ordinary evening. It feels, in a small way, like a promise already kept, proof that tomorrow will unfold exactly as you have pictured it. You know, of course, that plans rarely go entirely as planned, that someone will inevitably need an extra napkin or a different fork, that some small detail will shift once real people are actually seated around this table. But for tonight, in this quiet, empty room, everything is exactly as it should be. You turn off the dining room light before heading upstairs, though you find yourself pausing once more in the doorway, looking back at the table sitting there in the dim evening light, patient and ready, waiting quietly for tomorrow to arrive. It is Friday now, 5 o'clock, and you're standing in the middle of your own living room, in a dress you've already changed out of once, watching the clock the way some people watch the weather before a long drive. The house is finished. You know this. You've checked every room twice already this afternoon, straightened every cushion, confirmed every candle is in its holder, verified that the roast is exactly where it should be in its progress toward dinner. And yet you cannot quite settle, moving instead from room to room on some small errand that does not actually need doing, refolding a towel that was already folded correctly, adjusting a picture frame that was never crooked to begin with. This is the hour that belongs entirely to nerves, the strange, familiar tension that arrives every single time you host, no matter how many times you've done this before. You know the evening will go well. You've hosted dozens of dinners exactly like this one, and still, standing here in your stocking feet with your good shoes waiting by the door, you feel the same flutter of uncertainty you felt the very first time you did this, years ago, in a much smaller house with a much smaller table. You check the roast once more, though you checked it only 10 minutes ago and nothing has changed. You glance at the clock again. 40 minutes until your guests are expected to arrive, though you know from experience that someone will likely be early and someone else will likely be late. And you have learned to build a small buffer of patience into your own expectations accordingly. Your husband comes downstairs freshly shaved, straightening his tie in the hallway mirror, and catches your eye in the reflection. "You look lovely," he says, and you smile, though you glance down at your dress once more anyway, smoothing an already smooth hem, checking once more that everything is exactly as it should be. You move to the kitchen and check the coffee percolator, already prepared and waiting to be started the moment the first guest arrives. You check the rolls warming gently in the oven. You glance at the roast one final time, resisting the urge to open the oven door again, since you know from experience that opening it too often only slows the cooking. There is a particular kind of quiet in the house during this hour. The quiet of a stage set and waiting for its actors, everything prepared and yet nothing quite begun. You walk once more through the dining room, checking the table you set a full day ago still perfectly arranged, still waiting patiently for the evening to begin. You glance out the front window, half expecting to see a car already pulling into the driveway, though the street sits quiet and unremarkable in the early evening light. Somewhere down the block a dog barks twice and falls silent again. A car passes without slowing. Not yet, you think, though your pulse does not seem entirely convinced. This nervous hour, you have come to understand over the years, is simply the price of caring about something. If you did not care how the evening went, you would not feel this particular flutter in your chest, this small worry that something might go wrong despite every precaution you have taken. The nervousness itself, strange as it seems, is a kind of love, evidence of how much you want this evening to feel warm and welcoming for the people about to walk through your door. You check the clock one final time. 30 minutes now. You smooth your dress once more, glance at your reflection in the hallway mirror, and take a slow, steadying breath. Somewhere outside, in the fading Friday light, a car door closes. Let's pause right here at the exact moment the doorbell rings, because this is the sound the whole week has been quietly building toward. It is a simple sound, 2 soft notes, and yet it seems to rearrange the air in the house the instant it happens. You feel it before you consciously register it, a small jolt somewhere just beneath your ribs, followed almost immediately by a strange, settling calm. The waiting is over now. Whatever nervous energy filled the last hour dissolves the moment you hear that sound, replaced by something closer to readiness, the same instinct that takes over once an actor finally steps onto a stage after waiting anxiously in the wings. You glance once more at your reflection in the hallway mirror, smooth your dress with both hands, and move toward the door with measured, unhurried steps, though your heart is beating slightly faster than it was a moment ago. Your husband catches your eye from the living room, offering a small, reassuring nod, and you nod back before reaching for the doorknob. The door swings open, and there they are, standing on your porch in the early evening light, coats already halfway off their shoulders in anticipation of the warmth waiting inside. Their faces break into smiles the moment the door opens, and yours does the same, an entirely unforced expression of genuine welcome that erases in an instant every trace of the nervous hour that came before. "Well, don't you look wonderful," someone says, stepping across the threshold, and you laugh softly, waving off the compliment even as it warms you, already reaching to take their coat, already ushering them further into the house with the easy, practiced motions of a hostess who's done this many times before. The sound of the doorbell, once it fades, leaves behind a house that feels suddenly completely different than it did only moments ago. The quiet waiting rooms you walk through all afternoon are now filled with voices, with the small bustle of coats being hung and shoes being wiped politely on the front mat. The house that spent 2 full days preparing for exactly this moment finally has a reason to exist the way you built it to exist. Warm, welcoming, and full. You glance back toward the kitchen for just a moment, checking out of habit that everything is still on track, before turning your full attention back to your guests standing now in your front hall, chatting easily, already commenting on how lovely everything looks. The compliment lands exactly where you hoped it would, somewhere warm and quiet inside your chest, proof that the 2 days of work were worth every hour. Another car door closes outside, and you glance toward the window, already anticipating the next arrival, already feeling that same small flutter return, though gentler this time, more familiar now that the evening has properly begun. There is something almost magical about this particular moment in an evening, the instant a house shifts from private preparation into shared occasion. The doorbell, ordinary as it is, marks that shift more clearly than almost anything else could. Before it rings, the evening belongs entirely to you, your plans, your nervous checking and rechecking. After it rings, the evening belongs to everyone gathered inside these walls together, and something in you relaxes at the thought, some quiet permission to simply enjoy what happens next, rather than orchestrate it every step of the way. You usher your guests further into the living room, offering drinks, gesturing toward the good chairs, feeling the house settle comfortably around all of you the way it always does once the first doorbell has rung and the evening has finally properly begun. It is a few minutes past 6 now, and your front hall has become something like a small stage. Coats being taken, hellos exchanged, the particular choreography of greeting guests that you learned from watching your own mother do the same thing years before. You move easily between arrivals, taking coats with one hand while offering the other in greeting, a motion so practiced by now that you barely notice yourself performing it. Each coat gets hung carefully in the hall closet, arranged so that no one's good wool jacket ends up crushed beneath someone else's heavier overcoat. It is a small detail, the kind no guest will ever notice consciously, but one you've always taken seriously nonetheless. The front hall fills quickly with the particular sounds of arrival, greetings exchanged in overlapping voices, someone commenting on the weather, someone else remarking on how long it has been since the two families last saw each other. You move through it all with practiced warmth, remembering names and small details about each guest's life, asking after a sick relative here, a new job there, each small question landing exactly as intended. Proof that you have been paying attention all along. Your daughter appears briefly at the top of the stairs, peering down at the gathering commotion with open curiosity before you send her back to her room with a gentle reminder that dinner is still an hour away. She retreats obediently, though you notice her lingering at the top of the steps a moment longer, watching the adults below with the particular fascination children reserve for grown-up gatherings. They are not quite old enough to join. The front hall, ordinarily such a plain, functional space, transforms during these first few minutes into something closer to a small reception, full of movement and noise and the particular energy that only a house full of arriving guests can create. You find yourself enjoying this part of the evening more than you expected to. The flurry of greetings, the small compliments exchanged, the easy warmth of people genuinely glad to see one another after time apart. Someone hands you a bottle of wine as a small gift, wrapped carefully in the tissue paper, and you thank them warmly, setting it aside on the hall table to be opened later in the evening. Someone else compliments the smell coming from the kitchen, and you smile, waving off the praise even as it settles warmly in your chest. Further proof that the long hours of preparation were entirely worth it. Your husband works the room from the opposite direction, shaking hands, offering his own warm greetings, moving guests gently from the front hall into the living room where drinks are already waiting. Between the two of you, the choreography runs smoothly, each of you handling your own half of the greeting duties without needing to discuss it beforehand. The product of years spent hosting evenings exactly like this one together. By the time the last guest has arrived, the front hall has quieted again. Coats all safely hung. The small flurry of greetings settled into the steadier hum of conversation, now drifting in from the living room. You take one final glance around the hall, checking that everything remains tidy despite the recent commotion, before following your guests further into the house. There is something deeply satisfying about this particular part of the evening, the moment when all your careful preparation finally meets the warm, unpredictable reality of actual people gathered in your home. The front hall, quiet again now, has done its job admirably, welcoming each guest exactly the way you hoped it would, setting the tone for everything still to come this evening. You smooth your dress once more, glance toward the living room where the low hum of conversation continues to build, and step forward to join your guests, the evening now fully and properly begun. Let's step back into the kitchen for a moment, because even with guests in the living room, This is where you will spend a good portion of your evening, moving between the stove and the counter in a rhythm only you fully understand. The sounds of conversation drift in from the next room, muffled slightly by the kitchen doorway, punctuated occasionally by laughter you recognize even without seeing its source. You move through your familiar routine here, checking the roast, stirring the gravy, testing the rolls warming in the oven, all while keeping half an ear on the gathering just beyond the doorway. This is a strange kind of solitude, being alone in the kitchen while a full house of guests sits just a few steps away. You do not mind it. If anything, you have come to appreciate these small pockets of quiet within an otherwise busy evening. Moments where you can simply focus on the task in front of you without needing to maintain the bright, attentive expression expected of a hostess in the next room. Your daughter wanders in briefly, drawn by the smell of dinner nearly ready, and you hand her a small taste of gravy from the spoon, swearing her to secrecy about the extra pinch of pepper you added at the last minute. She grins and disappears again, keeping your small culinary secret exactly as instructed. You check the clock above the stove, calculating the remaining minutes until dinner should be served, adjusting the oven temperature slightly to account for the extra few minutes the conversation in the living room seems to be taking. This kind of quiet calculation has become second nature after years of hosting, an internal clock that runs alongside the actual one on the wall, constantly adjusting for small delays and unexpected pauses in the evening's rhythm. A friend pokes her head into the kitchen at one point, offering to help, and you wave her off gently, insisting you have everything well in hand, though you appreciate the offer more than you let on. There is a particular pride in managing an entire dinner party's kitchen work yourself, in knowing that every dish arriving at the table tonight passed through your own hands at some point during the long preparation. The kitchen itself, warm now from the oven and stove both working steadily, carries a rich mixture of smells, roasting meat, fresh rolls, the faint sweetness of whatever dessert waits patiently in the icebox for its turn later in the evening. You breathe it in occasionally between tasks, allowing yourself a small moment of satisfaction at how well everything seems to be coming together. Laughter erupts again from the living room, and you smile to yourself even without knowing the joke, simply pleased at the sound of your guests genuinely enjoying themselves. This, more than anything else, is the real measure of a successful evening, not whether every dish comes out exactly as planned, but whether the people gathered in your home feel comfortable enough to laugh freely together. You check the roast one final time, testing it with a fork the way your own mother taught you years ago, and find it exactly ready. You allow yourself a small private moment of satisfaction before reaching for the serving platters, beginning the careful process of plating a meal that took 2 full days to prepare for a single evening's enjoyment. The kitchen, busy and warm around you, feels entirely like your own private domain, even in the middle of a full house. This is where the evening truly comes together, away from the eyes of your guests, in the quiet, practiced motions of a hostess who has learned, over years of practice, exactly how to make a house feel like a celebration. It is later in the evening now, and the living room has settled into that particular hum of adult conversation, ice clinking softly against glass, someone laughing at a story you've already heard twice this year. You sit now among your guests, dinner finished, dishes cleared, allowing yourself finally to simply enjoy the company you spent 2 full days preparing to welcome. The lamps cast a warm golden light across the room, catching the last traces of cigarette smoke drifting lazily toward the ceiling, mingling with the faint scent of coffee still warming on the sideboard. Conversation moves easily from topic to topic, someone discussing a recent trip, someone else mentioning a piece of neighborhood news you had not yet heard. You listen more than you speak, content simply to watch your living room filled with warmth and easy laughter, proof that the evening you worked so hard to create has succeeded exactly as you hoped it would. Your husband sits across the room, deep in conversation with one of the other men, occasionally glancing your way with a small private smile that says more than words could. You return the smile, feeling, in this quiet moment, a particular kind of contentment that only comes from watching your own home filled with people you care about, all of them relaxed and genuinely enjoying themselves. The children have long since been sent upstairs, though you can hear the faint creak of floorboards occasionally, evidence that they are still awake, still curious about the sounds of adult conversation drifting up from below. You do not mind. Some of your own fondest childhood memories involve exactly this, lying awake upstairs, listening to the warm hum of grown-up laughter rising through the floor, imagining what such gatherings might someday feel like from the other side. Someone refills their coffee, someone else lights a fresh cigarette, and the conversation shifts again, this time towards some small piece of gossip from down the street, delivered with just enough humour to avoid feeling unkind. You listen, smiling, occasionally adding a small detail of your own, feeling entirely at ease now that the hardest work of the evening sits behind you. This is the part of hosting that rarely gets mentioned when people talk about the effort involved. This quiet, easy hour after the meal has been served and cleared, when the evening finally becomes less about performance and more about genuine connection. You look around the room slowly, taking in each familiar face, each small gesture of comfort, feeling a quiet gratitude for the particular kind of life that allows for evenings exactly like this one. It is the kind of ease that is harder to find now, an entire evening set aside simply for the pleasure of gathering. No other agenda beyond good food and easy conversation among people who genuinely enjoy one another's company. You find yourself hoping, quietly, that this feeling lingers a while longer before the evening inevitably draws to its close. Someone tells another story, and the whole room erupts into laughter once more, warm and unguarded. You laugh along with them, feeling the last of the day's earlier nervousness dissolve completely, replaced now by nothing but simple, uncomplicated contentment. The evening continues this way for a while longer, conversation drifting easily from subject to subject, laughter rising and falling in comfortable waves, and for now, at least, there is nowhere else you would rather be than exactly here, in your own living room, surrounded by the warm, familiar sound of people you love, gathered together for one more quiet, unhurried evening. It is closer to 9 o'clock now, and the percolator has been refilled twice already, its low burbling sound blending into the background hum of the evening, like something the house itself has come to expect. You move quietly among your guests with the fresh pot, topping off cups that have gone half empty during the last stretch of conversation, careful not to interrupt whoever happens to be speaking as you pour. This is a task you perform almost without thinking now, decades of practice having smoothed it into something closer to instinct than chore. The tilt of the pot, the careful pause just before the cup reaches its proper level, the small, murmured thank you that follows. The coffee itself has changed character since dinner ended, richer now, slightly stronger, the way it always seems to grow as an evening wears on and guests settle deeper into their chairs. Someone comments on this, remarking that your coffee always tastes better after 9 than it does at breakfast, and you laugh, though you privately suspect it has less to do with the coffee itself and more to do with the mood surrounding it. Warm lamplight, easy conversation, the particular contentment of a meal well finished. You refill your husband's cup as you pass his chair, and he glances up with a small, grateful nod before returning to whatever story he's in the middle of telling. You linger a moment longer than strictly necessary, listening in, smiling at a punchline you've heard at least 3 times over the years, but that still manages to land well among guests hearing it for the first time. The percolator's soft burbling from the kitchen has become by this hour a kind of quiet undercurrent to the whole evening, a sound so constant you barely notice it consciously anymore, though you would notice immediately if it stopped. It has been part of nearly every gathering you have ever hosted. This same steady rhythm running beneath the louder sounds of conversation and laughter, patient and reliable in a way that feels oddly like part of the household itself. Someone asks whether there is any coffee left as you pass with a pot, and you assure them there is plenty, that you always make extra for exactly this reason, having learned years ago that an evening's conversation tends to run longer than anyone initially expects. This too has become part of your particular skill as a hostess, this quiet anticipation of needs before they are even fully spoken aloud. You catch a glimpse of your reflection in the dark window as you move past it with the pot, hair still holding its shape from earlier in the evening, dress still crisp despite hours of hosting. You look, you think, exactly like someone comfortably in her element, which is precisely how you feel at this particular hour, the hardest work behind you now, the evening settled into its easy, familiar rhythm. The cigarette smoke has thickened slightly in the room by this point, curling lazily near the ceiling where the lamplight catches it, mixing faintly with the smell of coffee still steaming from freshly filled cups. It is a smell you have come to associate almost entirely with evenings exactly like this one. Warm, sociable, unhurried, the particular atmosphere of a house fully alive with the sound of people enjoying one another's company. You return the percolator to the kitchen counter, checking that enough remains for at least one more round before the evening winds down. Through the doorway, you can still hear fragments of conversation drifting from the living room, someone's laugh rising above the general murmur, a glass being set down gently on a side table. You pause there a moment, coffee pot still in hand, simply listening, feeling the quiet satisfaction of an evening unfolding exactly as you hoped it would. Your daughter's voice calls softly from the top of the stairs, asking if she can have a small cup of coffee too, mostly milk, the way you sometimes allow on special occasions. You smile and tell her not tonight, it's far too late for that, and send her back to bed with a promise that she can help clear cups in the morning instead. She retreats, satisfied enough with the compromise, and you return to the living room with the pot once more. The evening continues this way for a while. Coffee poured, conversations refreshed alongside the cups themselves, the whole room settling into that particular late hour when nothing feels rushed and no one seems eager for the evening to end. You move among your guests one more time, offering the last of the pot before setting it aside for good, content to simply sit now and let the conversation carry itself forward without you steering it. Let's notice something easy to overlook now. The thin ribbons of cigarette smoke drifting up toward your living room ceiling, curling lazily past the lampshade as though they too are in no particular hurry to leave. You empty the ashtrays quietly between conversations, a small, unobtrusive task performed without drawing attention to itself. The crystal dish emptied into a larger bowl kept specifically for this purpose in the kitchen, then wiped clean and returned to its spot on the side table. It is one of those small hostess duties no one ever thanks you for directly, precisely because it is done well enough that no one ever notices it happening at all. The smoke itself has become, by this hour, simply part of the room's atmosphere, woven into the warm lamplight and the low hum of conversation, until it feels less like something separate and more like the natural texture of an evening exactly like this one. Nearly everyone smokes tonight, cigarettes held loosely between fingers as stories unfold, the occasional thoughtful pause as someone taps ash carefully into a nearby dish before continuing. You watch the smoke drift upward from where you sit, catching the lamplight in soft, shifting patterns before dispersing somewhere near the ceiling, gone before it ever quite settles. There is something almost hypnotic about it, this slow, unhurried movement, matching perfectly the unhurried pace of the conversation happening beneath it. Someone offers you a cigarette from across the room, and you accept, lighting it from the small table lighter kept exactly for such moments, drawing in a slow breath before exhaling toward the ceiling along with everyone else's. It is a small, shared ritual, this collective exhaling of smoke into a room already thick with it, one of those quiet gestures of belonging that requires no explanation among people gathered for an evening like this. The room's particular scent by this hour has become a rich, layered thing, tobacco mixing with the last traces of dinner, the faint warmth of coffee still lingering from earlier rounds, the cleaner smell of lemon oil worked into the furniture 2 days before, now buried beneath everything more immediate. You breathe it in without quite noticing you're doing so, this being simply what your living room smells like during company, distinct from its ordinary daytime scent in ways you have long since stopped consciously registering. Your husband taps his own cigarette against the ashtray beside his chair, continuing a story that has everyone leaning in slightly, caught up in whatever detail he's building toward. You watch him from across the room, smiling faintly, still finding, after all these years, a particular pleasure in watching him hold a room's attention this easily. Someone else lights a fresh cigarette from the stub of their last one, a small habitual motion performed without breaking stride in their own conversation. The smoke rises again, joining the thin drifting layer already gathered near the ceiling, adding to an atmosphere that feels, at this point in the evening, entirely natural, entirely expected. You rise once more to empty another ashtray, moving quietly between guests, careful as always not to disturb whatever conversation happens to be unfolding as you pass. It is a small, repetitive task, performed many times over the course of an evening like this, and yet you find a kind of quiet satisfaction in it nonetheless. This steady maintenance of a room meant to feel effortlessly comfortable, despite the careful attention actually required to keep it that way. The smoke continues its slow drift upward as the evening wears on, gathering and dispersing in gentle waves above the warm lamplight, present in every photograph anyone might take of an evening exactly like this one, though rarely noticed directly by anyone actually living inside it. It is simply part of the room's texture tonight, as ordinary and expected as the coffee, the good china, the easy laughter rising and falling around you. You settle back into your chair, cigarette nearly finished, watching the last of the smoke curl upward before dissolving somewhere near the ceiling, gone as quietly as it arrived. It is nearly time for the meal now, and someone at the table has just complimented the roast, a small remark that settles warmly in your chest, the way only a compliment on your cooking ever quite manages to do. You smile and wave off the praise with practiced modesty, insisting it was nothing special, though privately you allow yourself a small moment of quiet pride. This particular roast took the better part of the afternoon to prepare correctly, seasoned carefully, checked at intervals throughout the day, timed precisely so that it would emerge from the oven exactly when your guests were seated and ready. The compliment comes from the woman seated to your right, someone whose own cooking you have always privately admired, which makes the remark land all the more warmly. She asks, almost in passing, what seasoning you used, and you tell her, honestly, though you also mention with a small laugh, that half of good cooking is simply patience, something no recipe can fully teach. Around the table, others begin to add their own small remarks, someone praising the tenderness of the meat, someone else commenting on how well it pairs with the gravy you spent extra time perfecting earlier in the afternoon. You accept each compliment graciously, though inside you feel the particular satisfaction that comes only from watching people genuinely enjoy something you worked hard to create. Your husband glances your way from across the table, offering a small private smile that says, without words, how proud he is of the meal you have prepared. It is a look you have come to recognize easily after years of marriage, one that still manages to warm you every time it happens. The conversation drifts briefly into cooking itself, someone asking how long you cooked the roast, someone else mentioning a recipe of their own they have been meaning to try. You answer each question patiently, offering small tips you have picked up over years of practice, careful not to seem as though you are showing off, though you cannot entirely hide your quiet pleasure at being asked. Your daughter, seated at the smaller table nearby, calls out that she helped too, which is not entirely true, though you allow the small exaggeration to stand, smiling at her enthusiasm. The adults around the table laugh warmly, someone remarking on how sweet it is that she wants credit for such a fine meal. You glance down at your own plate, only partly finished, having spent most of dinner more focused on your guests' enjoyment than your own meal. This too is simply part of hosting, a quiet sacrifice made so naturally you rarely think of it as sacrifice at all, more a simple, unremarkable fact of the evening. Someone asks if there might be a small second helping available, and you rise immediately, pleased at the request, moving toward the kitchen to retrieve the platter still warm from its earlier journey to the table. Nothing pleases a hostess quite so much as a guest wanting more of what she has prepared, proof beyond any spoken compliment that the meal has genuinely succeeded. You return with a platter, serving the extra portion with quiet satisfaction, watching as conversation continues easily around the table, the roast now thoroughly established as one of the evening's clear successes. The compliment from earlier lingers pleasantly in your mind even as talk moves on to other subjects, a small warm note carried quietly beneath the rest of the evening's conversation. By the time dessert is mentioned, the roast has been thoroughly praised from nearly every direction, and you find yourself, quietly, already planning to make it again the next time you host, filing away tonight's particular seasoning and timing as the exact formula worth repeating. It is a small victory, this compliment on the roast, but one that will stay with you far longer than the evening itself, a quiet measure of an evening well spent in your own kitchen. Let's sit at the table for a moment, where the bread basket makes its slow circuit from hand to hand, someone always insisting they've had enough just before taking one more anyway. You watch the basket travel around the table with quiet amusement, passed from guest to guest in that familiar, unhurried rhythm particular to a meal shared among people entirely at ease with one another. Someone declines at first, citing the roast already on their plate, only to reconsider moments later when the basket circles back around, unable to resist the smell of fresh bread still faintly warm from the oven. The rolls themselves came from the bakery specifically, not the box kind, a distinction you were careful to note on your list earlier in the week, and one that matters more than it might seem to an outsider. There is a particular texture to bakery rolls, a softness on the inside balanced against a light golden crust, that no amount of careful home baking quite manages to replicate. And tonight, watching your guests reach eagerly for seconds, you feel entirely justified in the extra trip across town it required to secure them. Butter follows the basket around the table in its own smaller dish, passed alongside with the same easy informality, someone buttering their roll generously while continuing uninterrupted whatever story they were telling. This is the particular pleasure of a meal among close company, the way small tasks like passing bread and butter fold seamlessly into ongoing conversation, never quite interrupting it, simply becoming part of its natural rhythm. Your husband takes a roll without comment, breaking it in half with the same unconscious motion he has performed at nearly every meal you have shared together over the years. You notice these small habitual gestures sometimes, quiet evidence of how well you know someone after this many years of marriage. The particular way he always breaks bread rather than cutting it, the small pause he takes before buttering it. Someone at the far end of the table asks whether there might be more rolls available, and you assure them there are. Having learned years ago always to buy more than seems strictly necessary, since bread has a way of disappearing faster than any other part of a meal like this one. Your daughter, from her spot at the smaller table nearby, requests one as well, and you send one over with a warm reminder to use her napkin, not her sleeve. The basket makes its way around once more, slightly lighter now, though still holding enough to satisfy anyone who might want one final piece before the meal moves toward its next course. Conversation continues easily around it, someone discussing a recent trip, someone else mentioning a piece of local news, the bread basket itself simply part of the evening's steady background rhythm rather than any particular focus of attention. There is something quietly satisfying about watching a simple basket of rolls circulate so easily among your guests, evidence in its own small way of how comfortable everyone has become over the course of the evening. A stiff, formal gathering rarely produces this kind of easy reaching across the table, this casual passing of bread and butter without a second thought. Tonight's gathering, by contrast, has settled into exactly the kind of warm, relaxed atmosphere you hoped to create when you first sat down to plan the evening 2 days before. You take a roll yourself as the basket passes your own seat, breaking it slowly, savouring the particular warmth and softness that only bakery bread seems to hold. Around you, conversation continues its easy flow, punctuated occasionally by someone requesting the butter dish once more, by someone else insisting again that this really will be their last roll of the evening. By the time the basket finally sits empty near the centre of the table, dinner has settled into its comfortable later stage, plates mostly cleared, conversation deepening into the kind of unhurried talk that only comes once a meal's more pressing business has been handled. You glance at the empty basket with quiet satisfaction, one more small sign of an evening unfolding exactly as you had hoped. It is somewhere near the kitchen doorway that the smaller table has been set up, just low enough for little hands, close enough that you can still hear every giggle drifting in from the next room. You glance over occasionally between your own conversations at the main table, checking on the small gathering of children seated around their own miniature version of tonight's dinner party. Someone's youngest has already spilled a small amount of milk, quickly wiped away by an older cousin with the practiced efficiency of a child who has clearly done this before. The children's table carries its own particular energy, quieter than the adult conversation nearby, but no less alive, filled with whispered secrets and the occasional muffled laugh quickly stifled by a hand pressed over a mouth. Your daughter sits at the head of this smaller table, having appointed herself, without any official ceremony, as the one responsible for making sure everyone gets their proper portion of rolls and butter. She takes this responsibility seriously, passing the small basket around with an earnestness that makes the adults nearby smile every time they glance over. There is something almost touching about watching children imitate, without quite realizing they are doing so, the same rituals of hosting and hospitality they have absorbed simply from watching their own parents over the years. The children's table itself is set more simply than the main one, everyday plates rather than good china, since even the most careful child cannot always be trusted around your mother's gold-rimmed set. Still, care has gone into it nonetheless, small folded napkins at each place, a modest arrangement of flowers in the centre that your daughter insisted on adding herself earlier in the afternoon, cut from the garden and arranged in a jar too small to be truly elegant but charming nonetheless. Conversation at the small table drifts in fragments toward the adults nearby, a debate over who gets the last roll, a whispered argument about whose turn it is to tell the next story, occasional bursts of laughter over some joke understood only among children of a certain age. You catch snippets of it now and then, smiling to yourself, remembering your own childhood evenings spent at exactly this kind of smaller table, listening to the low murmur of adult conversation just beyond, imagining what such gatherings might feel like once you were finally old enough to join them properly. One of the younger children grows restless partway through the meal, and an older cousin quietly distracts him with a small game involving folded napkins, keeping the peace without any adult needing to intervene directly. This too is part of the evening's quiet choreography, children managing their own small society at their own table, largely independent of the adults nearby, occasionally glancing over for approval or reassurance, but mostly content simply to be included, even at their own separate smaller scale. You rise at one point to check on them directly, refilling milk glasses, checking that everyone has had enough to eat, offering a quiet word of praise to your daughter for managing her small table so responsibly. She beams at the recognition, straightening slightly in her chair, clearly pleased at being noticed for her efforts. The smaller table finishes its meal well before the adults do, children growing restless with a particular energy that comes after a meal finished but before permission has been given to leave the table. You send them off eventually, once the last bites have been cleared, out toward the back room where they can play more freely without disturbing the ongoing conversation at the main table. Their laughter drifts back occasionally throughout the rest of the evening, filtering in from the other room, a warm undercurrent beneath the adult conversation continuing nearby. It is a comforting sound, proof that the evening has succeeded not just for the adults gathered around your good china, but for the children as well, each generation finding its own particular version of the same warm, unhurried gathering. You glance toward the doorway once more before returning your attention to your own table, smiling faintly at the thought of your daughter one day hosting an evening exactly like this one herself, having learned, without perhaps even realizing it yet, everything she needs to know simply from watching tonight unfold around her. Let's listen in for a moment to your husband, retelling the same story he tells at nearly every dinner party, the one about the flat tire in 1949, met tonight with the same warm laughter it always earns. You have heard this particular story more times than you could possibly count over the years of your marriage, and yet you find yourself smiling along with everyone else as he launches into it once again, gesturing with the same animated hands, pausing in exactly the same places for effect. There is something comforting in its familiarity, this well-worn tale that has become, over time, less about the actual event it describes, and more about the ritual of telling it, a small tradition repeated at gathering after gathering. The story itself involves a flat tire on a rainy night outside of town, a stranger who stopped to help, and a series of small mishaps that, in the retelling, have grown steadily more dramatic with each passing year. You suspect the true version of events was considerably less eventful than tonight's telling suggests, though you have long since stopped correcting the small exaggerations that have crept into it over time, understanding instinctively that the story has become something closer to folklore within your own small circle of friends, its accuracy mattering considerably less than its familiar comfort. Around the table, guests who have heard this story before settle into it easily, laughing at the same points they always laugh at, a few even mouthing along quietly with certain favourite lines. Someone hearing it for the first time tonight leans forward with genuine interest, caught up in the details, unaware that half the table could recite the ending along with your husband if asked. You watch him tell it, noticing small details you've observed many times before, the way his voice drops slightly for the dramatic middle section, the small pause he always takes just before the punchline, building anticipation even among those who already know exactly what is coming. There is a particular skill in telling the same story well enough, year after year, that it never quite grows stale, and your husband, you think privately, has mastered this skill completely The story reaches its familiar conclusion, and the table erupts into laughter, even those who have heard it a dozen times before joining in as though hearing it fresh. Someone remarks, as they always do, that surely by now the details have grown taller with each telling, and your husband protests with mock offence that every word remains entirely accurate, a claim met with further good-natured laughter around the table. You find yourself thinking, as you often do during this particular story, about how these small repeated rituals become part of what holds a group of friends together over years of gatherings like this one. It is not simply the story itself that matters, but the shared history of having heard it before, the comfort of familiar laughter in familiar company, evidence of friendship sturdy enough to survive the same joke told dozens of times without ever quite wearing thin. Someone at the table offers their own well-worn story in response. A small competition of favourite tales beginning to take shape, each guest offering up some familiar anecdote from their own history with the group. The conversation moves easily this way for a while, story following story, laughter rising and falling around the table in comfortable waves. Your husband catches your eye at one point during this exchange, offering a small private smile that acknowledges without words how many years you have now spent listening to each other's same stories, finding new laughter in them every single time regardless. You smile back, feeling a familiar warmth settle over you, grateful for an evening built from exactly this kind of comfortable repetition, familiar stories told among familiar friends, an anchor of sameness in an otherwise ever-changing world. It is later now, the plates cleared, and the good coffee cups have come out, thin and delicate, the kind you only trust to steady hands and a table already half emptied of its earlier nerves. You carry them out carefully from the kitchen, two at a time, setting each one down gently in front of its designated guest. The same gold-rimmed pattern that matched the dinner china now repeated in miniature for this final course. These cups have survived years of careful handling precisely because you never trust them to anyone else's hands during washing, insisting always on cleaning them yourself at the end of an evening like this one. The dessert itself waits on the sideboard, a cake you spent part of yesterday afternoon preparing, its layers carefully assembled and frosted with the kind of patience that only comes from years of practice. You cut it now into careful, even slices, plating each piece with the same quiet attention you gave to the roast earlier in the evening, understanding that a meal's final course carries its own particular weight in a guest's overall impression of the night. Compliments arrive almost immediately as the first bites are taken, someone praising the lightness of the cake, someone else asking, as they always do, for your particular recipe. You share it happily, though you also mention, with a small smile, that the real secret lies less in the recipe itself and more in resisting the urge to rush the baking process, something you learnt the hard way years ago after one particularly disappointing attempt. The good coffee cups fill with fresh coffee poured carefully from the pot, steam rising gently in the lamplight as conversation continues easily around the table. There is something almost ceremonial about this final course, the delicate cups requiring a slower, more careful kind of handling than the sturdier dishes used throughout the rest of the meal, the whole table settling into a gentler rhythm to match. Your daughter, peeking in from the doorway one final time before bed, asks quietly whether she might have a small taste of cake, and you cut her a modest sliver, sending her off with strict instructions to eat it carefully over a napkin. She disappears happily up the stairs, cake in hand, leaving the adults to their dessert and coffee. Conversation around the table has grown quieter by this point in the evening, the earlier energetic exchanges softening into something more contemplative, guests lingering over their coffee rather than rushing toward any particular conclusion. Someone remarks on how quickly the evening has passed, a sentiment met with general agreement around the table, everyone seemingly reluctant in their own quiet way, for the night to draw to its eventual close. You sip your own coffee slowly, savouring this particular hour more than almost any other part of the evening. The hardest work behind you now, nothing left to manage except simply being present among people you care about. The good china cups feel light and delicate in your hands, a small physical reminder of the care that has gone into every part of tonight, from the 2 days of preparation through this final quiet course. Someone requests a second small slice of cake, and you rise happily to cut it, pleased once again at the request, understanding it as one more small measure of the evening's success. The cake itself disappears steadily as it circles the table, evidence alongside the earlier emptied rolls basket and the well-praised roast that tonight's meal has satisfied your guest thoroughly from start to finish. By the time the last of the coffee has been poured and the final crumbs of cake cleared from each plate, the table has settled into that particular late evening quiet that signals a gathering nearing its natural conclusion. You glance around at the good china and delicate coffee cups scattered now across the table, thinking already of the careful washing and returning to the hutch that awaits you tomorrow, a small familiar task that will mark the quiet end of this particular chapter of hosting. Let's pause here, just past the kitchen doorway, where you stand for a private moment listening to the low murmur of your guests, letting yourself feel, just briefly, how well the evening has gone. You lean lightly against the doorframe, dish towel still in hand from wiping down a counter, allowing yourself this small pause before returning to the gathering in the next room. From here, you can watch without quite being watched yourself. Guests settled comfortably around the table, coffee cups half raised, conversation drifting easily from one subject to another in the warm lamplight. This particular vantage point has become, over years of hosting, something like private ritual of your own, a brief retreat taken sometime during nearly every gathering, just long enough to catch your breath and take stock of how the evening is actually unfolding. Tonight, watching from this quiet doorway, you feel a settling kind of satisfaction spread through your chest, the particular contentment that comes only from seeing 2 full days of careful work finally bear fruit in the form of relaxed, genuinely happy guests. You notice small details from this distance that you might otherwise miss while seated among the conversation yourself. The way your husband leans back in his chair, clearly at ease, laughing at something just said. The way one guest reaches without thinking for a second slice of cake, evidence enough that the dessert has succeeded. The way the whole room seems to glow slightly under the lamplight, warm and golden, exactly the atmosphere you hoped to create when you first began planning this evening 2 days ago. The dish towel in your hands is nearly forgotten now, your attention entirely absorbed by this quiet observation of an evening unfolding successfully around you. There is a particular pleasure in this kind of watching, distinct from actually participating in the conversation, a chance to appreciate the whole shape of the evening rather than simply its individual moments. You think, briefly, of everything that led to this exact instant, the list written in pencil on your kitchen counter, the good china washed carefully by hand, the lemon oil worked into every surface of the dining room, the nervous hour spent watching the clock before the first doorbell finally rang. All of it, every small hour of preparation, has led to precisely this moment. A room full of guests laughing easily together in your own home. Someone glances toward the kitchen doorway and catches your eye, waving you back toward the table with a warm smile, and you smile back, gathering yourself to rejoin the gathering properly. But you allow yourself one final second in this quiet doorway first, one last private moment of appreciation before stepping back into the warm, active centre of your own dinner party. This brief pause, you've come to understand over years of hosting evenings like this one, is not simply about catching your breath. It is about allowing yourself, if only for a moment, to actually witness the evening you work so hard to create, rather than simply moving through it task by task without ever truly seeing the whole. Most hostesses, you suspect, never quite give themselves this permission, too caught up in managing each small detail to step back and appreciate the larger picture. You fold the dish towel over the edge of the counter beside you and take one final glance at the warm, glowing room ahead, guests settled comfortably, coffee cups nearly empty, conversation still flowing easily in the late evening quiet. It has been, you think, exactly the kind of evening you hope to create, warm and unhurried, filled with good food and easy company. You step forward from the doorway at last, rejoining your guests at the table, carrying with you this small, private moment of quiet satisfaction that will linger long after the evening itself has ended, tucked away alongside all your other memories of gatherings exactly like this one. It is a small thing, almost nothing, but a guest has just noticed the new curtains in the front room, and the compliment lands somewhere quiet and pleased inside you. You glance up from your seat, momentarily surprised that anyone noticed at all, since you hung them only 2 weeks ago and had half expected them to simply blend into the room without comment. The fabric catches the lamplight now in soft, warm folds, a pale gold that took you 3 trips to the fabric store before you finally settled on exactly the right shade to match the rest of the room. The guest who noticed, a woman you have known for years, asks where you found the fabric, and you tell her, pleased at the question, describing the small shop downtown where you eventually track down exactly what you had pictured in your mind. She nods thoughtfully, glancing toward the window again, admiring the way the curtains fall, the careful pleating you spent an entire afternoon adjusting until it hung correctly. There is a particular satisfaction in this kind of compliment, quieter than praise for the roast or the cake, but no less meaningful for its subtlety. Curtains are not something guests typically comment on, unless something about them genuinely catches the eye, and you find yourself sitting a little straighter, pleased that this small, private project of yours has been noticed and appreciated. You think back to the afternoon spent measuring the windows, checking twice before cutting a single piece of fabric, unwilling to waste even a small amount of the careful yardage you had selected. Your husband had commented at the time that new curtains seemed like an unnecessary expense, the old ones having served perfectly well for years, but you had persisted quietly, knowing exactly the effect you wanted the room to have. Now, watching your guest admire them in the soft evening light, you feel entirely justified in that persistence. The old curtains, serviceable as they were, had never quite caught the light the way these new ones do, never given the room this particular warm, golden quality that seems, tonight, to be adding something subtle but real to the whole atmosphere of the evening. Another guest joins the conversation, adding her own small compliment, mentioning how the colour seems to make the whole room feel warmer somehow, more inviting. You accept the praise graciously, though internally you allow yourself a small private moment of vindication, thinking of your husband's earlier scepticism, deciding you will mention this compliment to him later, gently, once the guests have gone home. The conversation moves on naturally after a moment, drifting towards some other subject, but you find your gaze returning briefly to the curtains themselves, seeing the room now slightly differently through your guest's eyes rather than your own overly familiar perspective. This happens sometimes during an evening like this, small details of your own home suddenly becoming visible again through the fresh attention of visitors, details you'd grown so accustomed to that you'd nearly stopped noticing them yourself. You think, not for the first time tonight, about how much of hosting involves precisely this kind of quiet transformation, taking an ordinary, familiar space and making it feel if only briefly, slightly special, slightly more considered than its everyday version. The new curtains are simply one small piece of this larger effort. Alongside the polished floors and the good china and the carefully planned menu, each element working together to create an evening that feels, to your guests, effortlessly warm and welcoming. Someone else glances toward the window now too, having overheard the earlier compliment, adding their own brief remark of approval before conversation shifts elsewhere entirely. You smile to yourself, quietly pleased, tucking this small moment away alongside the evening's other quiet successes. Later, once your guests have gone and the house has settled back into its ordinary quiet, you know you will glance at these curtains again, seeing them now with a small added layer of pride, remembering the compliment paid to them tonight. It is a small thing, this brief exchange about fabric and colour, but it lingers pleasantly nonetheless. One more thread woven into the quiet fabric of an evening that, by every measure, has gone exactly as you hoped it would. Let's notice the way the evening has gently divided itself. The men gathered near the radio talking about work and baseball, the women closer to the kitchen, talking about something entirely their own. You glance between the two small gatherings now forming naturally within your living room, each cluster having drifted, almost without anyone deciding it consciously, toward its own particular corner and its own particular conversation. Your husband sits with the other men near the radio, low voices discussing something about a recent ball game, occasionally interrupted by a burst of laughter over some remembered play or missed opportunity. Closer to the kitchen, you and the other women have settled into your own quieter conversation, softer in volume, different in texture entirely from the discussion happening across the room. Here, the talk moves between children and households, a recipe someone wants to share, a small piece of news about a mutual friend's upcoming visit. It is a conversation built from entirely different material than the one happening near the radio, and yet somehow, by the end of the evening, both conversations will have contributed equally to the overall warmth of the gathering. This division happens at nearly every dinner party you host, though you have never once had to arrange it deliberately. It simply occurs, guests drifting naturally toward whichever conversation feels most familiar, most comfortable, most suited to whatever they most want to discuss this particular evening. You have come over years of hosting to appreciate this natural sorting rather than fight against it, understanding that forcing everyone into a single unified conversation rarely produces the same ease as allowing smaller groups to form organically. You catch fragments of the men's conversation occasionally, enough to know they have moved from baseball into some discussion of work, someone complaining good-naturedly about a difficult supervisor, someone else offering sympathy alongside his own similar complaint. The radio hums quietly in the background beneath their voices, occasionally drawing brief attention when some particular score or announcement catches everyone's interest at once. On your own side of the room, conversation has turned toward a friend's daughter, recently married, and the small challenges of adjusting to a new household. You listen with genuine interest, offering your own small piece of advice from years of experience, understanding this kind of exchange as one of the quiet, practical services women offer one another, passing along accumulated wisdom in casual conversation rather than any formal lesson. Occasionally, a comment travels between the two groups, someone from the men's side calling over some remark about the ball game that draws a brief, amused response from the women nearby, or a piece of news from your own conversation prompting a brief acknowledgement from across the room. The two conversations remain distinct, but not entirely separate, connected by the shared space of your living room and the shared occasion of the evening itself. You think, watching this natural division unfold, about how this particular pattern has repeated itself at nearly every gathering you can remember attending, going back to childhood evenings watching your own parents' guests separate into these same familiar clusters. There is something almost comforting in this repetition, a small unspoken tradition that requires no explanation, simply understood by everyone present as the natural shape a gathering takes once dinner has ended and conversation settles into its later, more relaxed stage. Your daughter's earlier curiosity watching from the stairs comes to mind briefly. Someday she'll understand this same pattern intuitively, without ever needing anyone to explain it to her, absorbing it simply from years of watching evenings exactly like this one unfold in her own childhood home. The conversation on your side of the room shifts again, moving now towards some lighter subject, a recent piece of a neighbourhood news, met with soft laughter and a few exchanged glances of amusement. Across the room, the men's conversation continues its own steady rhythm, occasionally rising in volume before settling back into its familiar murmur. You glance once more between the two gatherings, feeling a quiet satisfaction at how naturally the whole room has settled into this comfortable, familiar shape, each conversation contributing its own particular texture to an evening that, taken as a whole, feels exactly as warm and easy as you had hoped it would. It is getting later now, and you find yourself glancing at the mantel clock without quite meaning to, not out of impatience, but out of the quiet instinct of a hostess keeping track of the evening's shape. The hands read closer to 10 than you expected, and you feel a small flicker of surprise at how quickly the hours have passed since the first doorbell rang. This particular kind of clock checking has become second nature over years of hosting, less a conscious calculation than a background awareness running quietly beneath the rest of the evening's conversation, tracking not whether guests should leave, but simply how the night is unfolding relative to your own private, unspoken sense of its proper rhythm. You glance again a few minutes later, noting the position of the hands almost without registering the specific time itself, simply absorbing the general sense that the evening has entered its later, more settled stage. Conversation around you has slowed slightly from its earlier energetic pace, guests now leaning back in their chairs rather than forward, coffee cups nearly empty, the particular unhurried quality of an evening winding gently toward its natural conclusion. This is not a signal for anything urgent, you remind yourself, simply the clock doing what clocks do, marking time whether or not anyone in the room is paying close attention, and yet you find your eyes drawn to it every so often nonetheless. Some old habit from years of managing evenings like this one, always keeping half an eye on how the night is progressing, even while fully present in whatever conversation happens to be unfolding around you. Your husband catches you glancing at the clock at one point and offers a small, knowing smile from across the room, understanding immediately what the gesture means without needing any explanation. He has watched you do this at nearly every gathering you have ever hosted together, this quiet, habitual check-in with the passing hour, and he has learned over the years to read your small expressions afterward, gauging from your face alone whether the evening seems to be running exactly as planned or whether some small adjustment might be needed. Tonight your expression gives away nothing but quiet satisfaction. The evening has unfolded almost exactly as you hoped it would. Dinner served at the right hour, dessert following at its proper time, conversation settling now into this comfortable later stage without any sense of rush or awkward lingering. The clock, when you check it, simply confirms what you already sensed intuitively, that the night has reached its natural late hour, guests comfortable and unhurried, no one yet showing signs of wanting to leave. You think briefly about earlier evenings that did not go quite so smoothly, dinners that ran later than intended, awkward silences that stretched a beat too long before someone finally rescued the conversation. Tonight carries none of that uncertainty. The clock's steady ticking feels less like a countdown and more like a quiet confirmation, marking the passage of an evening that has succeeded exactly as intended. Someone at the table mentions, almost in passing, how quickly time seems to have moved tonight, a sentiment that echoes your own private observation exactly. You nod in agreement, smiling, privately pleased that your guests share this same sense of an evening that has felt effortless and enjoyable, rather than long or tedious. You check the clock once more, noting that it has moved only a few minutes since your last glance, and feel a small, quiet reassurance in this. The evening still has some time left to unfold naturally before its eventual close. Time enough for one more round of coffee, one more story, one more comfortable stretch of easy conversation before anyone begins reaching for their coat. This habit of checking the clock without quite meaning to, you understand by now, is simply part of what it means to host well. A quiet, near constant awareness running beneath everything else, ensuring that an evening unfolds at exactly the right pace, neither rushed nor overstayed. Tonight, that awareness brings only satisfaction, confirmation of an evening moving exactly as it should toward its own natural, unhurried conclusion. Let's step back into the front hall once more. Coats being gathered again, this time in reverse. The same choreography from earlier in the evening now running gently backward. You notice the shift before anyone announces it directly. A small change in posture among one couple. A slight straightening in their chairs. A glance exchanged between them that you've learned, over years of hosting, to recognize immediately as the quiet signal that an evening is beginning to draw toward its close for at least this particular pair of guests. Sure enough, within a few minutes, they rise, offering the familiar gentle protests of guests who genuinely enjoyed themselves but recognize nonetheless that the hour has grown late enough to warrant heading home. You rise as well, moving toward the front hall alongside them. The same warm hospitality you offered at their arrival, now extended once more in reverse. Their coats hang exactly where you placed them hours earlier, and you retrieve them carefully, handing each one over with the same practiced care you used when first taking them from their shoulders at the start of the evening. The front hall fills again with conversation, though quieter now, more subdued than the earlier flurry of arrival, punctuated by warm thanks and genuine compliments about the evening. Wonderful dinner, someone says, and you accept the praise graciously, insisting it was nothing at all, though you feel, privately, the same quiet satisfaction you felt earlier when the roast was first complimented at the table. Your husband joins you in the hall, shaking hands warmly, offering his own farewells alongside yours, the two of you working together in this final piece of the evening's choreography, exactly as smoothly as you managed the earlier greetings. There is a particular symmetry to hosting, you think, watching this reversal unfold. The same warmth extended both at arrival and departure, though each carries its own distinct quality. One full of anticipation, the other full of quiet, satisfied closure. The departing guests linger a moment longer at the door, exchanging a few final words, making tentative plans for some future gathering, before finally stepping out into the cool evening air. You and your husband stand together in the doorway, waving as they make their way down the front walk toward their car, the porch light casting a soft glow across the darkened lawn. Behind you, the remaining guests continue their conversation, the departure of one couple doing little to disturb the warm, settled atmosphere still filling the rest of the house. You close the front door gently after the car has pulled away, feeling the particular quiet satisfaction that comes from watching guests leave clearly happy, clearly grateful for an evening well spent in your company. You return to the living room, rejoining the remaining conversation, though you find your attention drifting occasionally now toward the front hall, half anticipating the next departure that will inevitably follow before too long. This is simply the natural rhythm of an evening's ending. guests leaving gradually rather than all at once, each departure its own small, quiet ritual repeated with slight variation as the night continues to wind down. Your daughter, having been allowed to stay up slightly later than usual given the special occasion, peeks once more from the stairway, watching this small procession of departing guests with the same curiosity she showed earlier in the evening. You catch her eye and give a small nod, permission enough for her to finally head off to bed now that the excitement of arrivals and departures has settled into its quieter closing stage. The remaining guests, noticing the first departure, begin their own small conversations about the lateness of the hour, though none of them yet moves to follow the first couple's example. You settle back into your own seat, coffee cup nearly empty beside you, content to let the evening continue its natural, unhurried progression toward its eventual close, exactly as it should. It is nearly 10 o'clock, and you're standing on the porch in the cool evening air, waving as the first car pulls away, its headlights sweeping briefly across your lawn before disappearing down the street. The night air feels pleasantly cool against your skin after the warmth of the crowded living room, a welcome change that you notice immediately as you step outside alongside your husband to see off this last departing group. The porch light casts its familiar yellow glow across the front steps, illuminating just enough of the yard to make the departure feel properly ceremonial, a small final gesture of hospitality extended even past the front door itself. You wave once more as the car's taillights disappear around the corner, then linger a moment longer on the porch, unwilling quite yet to step back inside and face the quiet work of cleaning that awaits you. Your husband stands beside you, arms crossed loosely against the evening chill, both of you simply enjoying this brief, quiet pause between the bustle of the party and the work of restoring the house to its ordinary state. The neighbourhood around you has settled into its own late evening quiet, most houses along the street now dark except for a porch light or two, the occasional glow of a television flickering behind drawn curtains. Somewhere down the block a dog barks once, then falls silent again. The street feels peaceful in a way that contrasts pleasantly with the warm, busy hours you've just spent inside your own home. You glance back toward your lit windows, warm and golden against the darkened evening, hearing faintly still the murmur of your remaining guests continuing their conversation inside. There is something satisfying about seeing your own house this way, from the outside glowing warmly in the dark street, evidence visible even from the sidewalk of the successful gathering happening within. Your husband reaches for your hand briefly, a small quiet gesture of affection rarely offered so openly in front of guests, but natural enough now in this private moment shared only between the two of you on your own front porch. You squeeze his hand back, feeling in this brief pause a particular contentment that comes only after hosting an evening that has gone exactly as hoped. The cool air continues to settle pleasantly around you both, a welcome contrast to the warmer, smokier atmosphere still lingering inside. You breathe it in slowly, feeling some of the evening's accumulated tension finally beginning to release from your shoulders, replaced now by simple, quiet satisfaction. Somewhere inside, laughter rises briefly from your remaining guests, audible even out here on the porch, reminding you that the evening is not quite finished yet, that more departures and farewells still await before the house finally empties back into its ordinary quiet. You glance at your husband, and he nods slightly, both of you understanding without words that it's time to step back inside and rejoin the remaining conversation. Before you do, you take one final moment on the porch, looking out at the quiet street, feeling the cool night air one last time against your skin. This brief pause between the party and its clean-up has always felt to you like one of the evening's quieter pleasures, a moment of private reflection before the more practical work of hosting resumes. You turn back toward your front door at last, your husband's hand still loosely holding yours, and step back inside together, the warmth and light of your living room welcoming you back into the last stretch of an evening that has, by every measure, succeeded exactly as you hoped it would. Let's return to the dining room, empty now except for you, gathering the good china carefully, one plate at a time, back into the same careful stacks it came from 2 nights before. The house has grown quiet around you. Guests all departed now, your husband already upstairs checking on your daughter before heading to bed himself. You remain downstairs a while longer, unwilling quite yet to leave the good china sitting overnight on the table, preferring instead to see this particular task through to its proper conclusion before allowing yourself to rest. You move slowly around the table, collecting each plate carefully, checking briefly for any chips or cracks that might have occurred during the evening's use, though you find, as always, everything remains intact. This china has survived many evenings exactly like this one, and tonight proves no exception, each piece exactly as sturdy and beautiful as it was when you first lifted it carefully from the hutch 2 days ago. The dining room itself feels different now than it did just an hour earlier, emptied of its earlier warmth and conversation. The candles burned down to soft stubs in their holders, the tablecloth showing small signs of the evening's use, a faint stain here, a slight wrinkle there. You will deal with the cloth tomorrow, soaking it carefully before it goes into the wash, but tonight your attention remains focused on the china itself. You carry the plates in careful stacks back toward the kitchen, moving slowly to avoid any risk of chipping, setting them gently beside the sink where you will wash each one by hand tomorrow morning, rather than trusting them to any rushed cleaning tonight. This too has become part of your particular ritual around this special china, never washing it in haste, always reserving a quiet, unhurried hour specifically for its careful cleaning. Returning to the dining room, you gather the silverware next, counting each piece automatically out of long habit, ensuring nothing has gone missing amid the evening's activity. Everything is accounted for, exactly as you expected, and you set it aside in its own careful pile, ready for tomorrow's washing alongside the china. The candles you extinguish last, watching each small flame flicker out before you lift the holders away, wax having pooled slightly at their base in small hardened drips you will need to scrape away eventually. You leave them for now, setting them carefully on the sideboard, another small task for tomorrow rather than tonight. Standing alone now in the dining room, table finally cleared, you allow yourself a moment simply to look at the room in its emptied state, comparing it silently to how it looked only hours earlier, filled with laughter and conversation and the warm glow of candlelight. There is something quietly satisfying about this particular transition, watching a room shift back from its special occasion self into its more ordinary everyday version. You think, briefly, about all the careful work that led to tonight's dinner, the 2 full days of preparation, the polished floors, the pressed tablecloth, the carefully chosen china. All of it existed for these few hours, this one evening of warmth and conversation among people you care about, and now as you stand here in the quiet aftermath, you feel a particular kind of contentment that only comes from work well done and fully appreciated. The dining room table sits empty now except for its everyday covering, restored to its ordinary function, waiting patiently for tomorrow's breakfast rather than tonight's celebration. You glance around the room one final time, checking that everything sits properly in place before turning off the light and making your way finally toward the stairs, ready now for the quiet rest that awaits you after 2 long days of careful preparation and 1 evening of warm, successful hosting. It is well past 10 now, and you finally sit down in your own living room, the first time all evening the chair has been yours alone, the house settling quietly back into its ordinary shape around you. The room around you looks different now than it did just an hour earlier. Dishes cleared, ashtrays emptied, the last traces of your guests' visit tidied away into their proper places. Only the faint smell of cigarette smoke and coffee still lingers in the air, evidence of the evening that has just concluded, though even this will fade by morning, replaced by tomorrow's more ordinary household scents. You sink into your chair with the particular relief that comes only after 2 full days of steady preparation and 1 long evening of careful hosting, feeling your shoulders loosen for what feels like the first time since Wednesday morning. Your feet, tired from standing and moving steadily throughout the evening, finally rest properly, and you allow yourself to simply sit here for a while, not thinking of anything in particular, simply appreciating the quiet. The house feels different in this late hour, emptied now of its earlier noise and movement, settled into the particular stillness that follows any successful gathering. You can hear, faintly, the house's own small sounds, a floorboard settling somewhere upstairs, the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, sounds ordinarily lost beneath the day's regular activity, but audible now in this unusual late quiet. Your husband comes down briefly, having checked on your daughter, and settles into his own chair nearby, letting out a long, satisfied breath. "That went well," he says simply, and you nod, agreeing completely, too tired for any longer response but entirely in agreement with his assessment. You think back over the whole arc of the evening, the careful list written 2 days ago, the china washed and arranged, the nervous hour before the first guests arrived, the easy warmth that settled over the whole gathering once dinner began. Every small piece of preparation led eventually to exactly this outcome, an evening enjoyed thoroughly by everyone who attended, guests departing with genuine warmth and gratitude rather than polite empty compliments. There is a particular satisfaction in sitting here now. Work finished, guests gone home happy, house slowly settling back into its familiar rhythm. You know tomorrow will bring its own small tasks, the good china still waiting to be washed properly, the tablecloth needing its careful soak before laundering, the everyday rhythm of household life resuming exactly where it left off before this small special interruption of hosting began. But tonight, sitting quietly in your own living room with your husband nearby, none of tomorrow's tasks feel particularly urgent. There is only this present, quiet moment, the satisfaction of an evening successfully hosted, the simple physical relief of finally sitting down after so many hours spent standing, moving, managing every small detail of someone else's comfort and enjoyment. You glance toward the dining room, dark now, table cleared and waiting patiently for tomorrow's ordinary breakfast rather than tonight's special dinner. The whole house, in fact, seems to be settling back into itself this way, room by room, transitioning quietly from its special occasion self back toward its everyday familiar shape. This particular kind of quiet, you think, sitting here in your own chair at the end of a long, successful evening, is one of the private rewards of hosting rarely mentioned by anyone discussing the effort involved. It is not simply the compliments received during the party itself, welcome as those were, but this later, quieter satisfaction, sitting alone with your husband in a house that has just done exactly what you hoped it would do, welcomed people warmly, fed them well, sent them home happy. You close your eyes briefly, allowing yourself this final, unhurried moment before the evening properly ends and the quiet business of tomorrow's clean-up begins. For now, at least, there is nothing left to manage, nothing left to prepare, only this simple, well-earned rest at the close of a long day's quiet work. Let's step into your kitchen the following morning, where the good china sits waiting exactly where you left it beside the sink. patient under the pale early light while the rest of the house still sleeps around you. You tie on your apron over your housecoat and fill the basin with warm water, testing the temperature carefully with your wrist before adding the good dishes. This is not a task you rush, not even the morning after a long evening of hosting, because rushing is precisely how chips happen, how a careless bump against the faucet turns a family heirloom into something merely serviceable. You've learned this lesson more than once over the years, and you have no intention of learning it again today. The kitchen carries a different quality of quiet this morning than it did during the party itself. Sunlight slants low through the window over the sink, catching motes of dust drifting lazily in the air, illuminating the counter where crumbs from last night's cake still linger faintly despite your best efforts the evening before. You wipe them away now, unhurried, letting the morning settle around you the way it always does after a gathering. This particular blend of tiredness and satisfaction that only comes after successfully hosting people you care about. You lift the first plate from the stack and lower it gently into the warm water, working a soft cloth in slow circles across its surface, careful around the gold rim the way you always are. The suds part slightly beneath your hands, and you rinse the plate under a slow trickle from the tap before setting it carefully in the drying rack. Exactly the way your mother taught you to do it years ago in her own kitchen, in a house you no longer live in but still carry with you in gestures like this one. Your husband appears eventually, drawn downstairs by the smell of the coffee you started before beginning the dishes, and he leans against the doorway for a moment, watching you work. "Good morning," he says, and you glance up briefly, smiling, before returning your attention to the plate in your hands. He does not offer to help, not because he is unwilling, but because both of you understand, without needing to discuss it, that this particular ritual belongs to you alone, a quiet continuation of the same care you gave the china 2 days earlier when you first lifted it from the hutch. The dining room beyond the kitchen doorway looks different in the morning light than it did last night. Ordinary again, the good tablecloth already stripped away and soaking in a separate basin nearby, its faint stains from last night's dinner slowly working themselves loose in the cool water. You will hang it later today, once the worst of it has soaked free, letting the afternoon sun finish the job the soaking started. Your daughter wanders down eventually, still in her nightgown, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and asks if she can help dry the cups. You hand her the softest towel, the one reserved for exactly this purpose, and she takes the task seriously, wiping each delicate cup with the careful concentration of a child who's been entrusted with something important. You watch her from the corner of your eye, remembering briefly, standing in almost this exact spot as a girl yourself, drying your own mother's good china the morning after some long-forgotten gathering. By mid-morning, the last piece has been washed, dried, and returned carefully to its place behind the glass of the hutch, the door creaking shut with that same familiar sound that started this whole process 2 days earlier. You stand back for a moment, looking at the closed cabinet, the china safely returned to its resting place until the next occasion calls for it again, whenever that might be. There is a particular satisfaction in this final task, quieter than the satisfaction of a successful dinner party itself, but no less real. It is the satisfaction of a job finished properly, of care extended not just through the evening of hosting but through the following morning as well, ensuring that everything used so happily the night before returns to its place undamaged, ready to be brought out again for whatever future gathering eventually calls it back into service. You untie your apron and hang it on its hook, glancing once more around your kitchen, now fully restored to its ordinary morning self, coffee still warm in the pot, sunlight still slanting gently through the window. The party has properly ended now, you think, not with the last guest's departure the night before, but with this quiet morning ritual of washing and returning care extended fully to its natural conclusion. It is early afternoon now, and the telephone rings in the front hall, its sharp bell cutting through the quiet of a house, still slowly recovering from the evening before. You wipe your hands on your apron before answering, already guessing correctly that it will be one of a last night's guests calling to offer their thanks. This is simply how these things are done. A proper phone call the day after, never left to chance or forgotten in the busyness of ordinary life. A small courtesy extended in return for the evening's hospitality. The voice on the other end is warm and familiar, thanking you again for such a lovely dinner, mentioning how much they enjoyed the roast, how delightful the company was, how they simply must have you and your husband over themselves before too long. You accept the thanks graciously, insisting it was nothing at all, though you feel, hearing it again in the light of day, the same quiet pleasure the original compliments brought you the night before. You stand in the front hall during this call, the same hall that filled with coats and greetings only a day earlier, now quiet except for your own voice and the muffled one coming through the receiver. The telephone cord stretches slightly as you shift your weight, glancing toward the dining room where the good china sits once more safely behind its glass, the whole house slowly returning to its ordinary rhythm after the special occasion of the evening before. The conversation drifts naturally into small details of the party, someone recalling a particular story told during dinner, someone else mentioning how lovely the new curtains looked in the lamplight. You find yourself smiling as you listen, pleased that these small details left such a clear impression, evidence that the careful attention you paid to every part of the evening did not go unnoticed. Your guest mentions too how well behaved the children were at their own smaller table, complimenting your daughter specifically for her thoughtful hosting of the younger ones. You thank them for noticing, making a private note to share this particular compliment with your daughter later, understanding how much it will mean to her, to hear that her efforts were appreciated by someone outside the family. The call continues for a while longer, moving eventually toward other small pieces of news, a mutual friend's recent visit, plans forming loosely for some future gathering, though nothing definite yet. This too is part of the ritual of the day after telephone call, not simply an exchange of thanks, but a continuation of the warmth begun the evening before. Friendship extended a little further through this small, ordinary act of picking up the telephone. You glance at the clock above the mantel as the conversation eventually winds toward its natural close, noting that nearly 20 minutes have passed since you first answered. Time that felt, in the moment, considerably shorter. There is something almost meditative about these calls, an easy, unhurried exchange that mirrors, in its own smaller way, the unhurried quality of the dinner party itself. After you hang up the receiver, you stand for a moment longer in the quiet front hall, feeling the small, accumulated warmth of the conversation settle pleasantly alongside yesterday's other satisfactions. The telephone rings again within the hour, another guest calling with their own thanks, and you answer again with the same warm patience, understanding this as simply part of the proper conclusion to any evening of hosting, gratitude extended and received in equal measure the day after. By late afternoon, you will have received several such calls, each one a small confirmation that the evening succeeded exactly as you hoped, each compliment landing gently alongside the others, building into a quiet, cumulative sense of satisfaction that no single moment during the party itself could have provided on its own. This is the slower second half of hosting, you think, less visible than the dinner itself, but no less important, this exchange of thanks that properly closes the circle and evening's hospitality opens. Let's step outside for a moment, into the quiet of your own front yard the following morning, where a neighbour pauses at her mailbox just long enough to mention how many cars she noticed parked along the street the night before. You smile and explain briefly that you had a small dinner party, nothing too elaborate, though you both understand this modest description does little justice to the 2 full days of preparation that actually went into the evening. Your neighbour nods knowingly, having hosted her own gatherings often enough to recognise the particular understatement housewives tend to use when describing their own considerable efforts. She mentions, too, catching a glimpse of your front hall through the window as she walked her dog past your house the evening before, coats hung neatly, guests gathered warmly just inside the door. It surprises you slightly. This small awareness that your private evening was in fact visible in small pieces to anyone passing by on the street outside. The warm lamplight spilling through your windows into the darkening evening, offering passers-by a brief glimpse into the gathering happening within. This is simply part of life in a neighbourhood like yours, you think, standing now at the edge of your own front lawn in the quiet morning light. Nothing happens in complete isolation here, not truly. Every gathering visible in some small way to whoever happens to be walking past at the right moment. Every car parked along the curb noted, consciously or not, by neighbours going about their own ordinary business. You do not mind this particular kind of visibility, understanding it as simply the natural texture of neighbourhood life. The same visibility that lets you notice, in turn, when someone down the street has visitors of their own, when a car you do not recognise sits parked in front of a neighbour's house for several days running. It is a quiet, unspoken awareness that binds a street together, this mutual noticing of one another's comings and goings, forming its own kind of community even among households that rarely interact directly. Your neighbour asks, with genuine interest rather than mere politeness, what you served, and you describe the roast, the good rolls from the bakery, the cake that took most of yesterday afternoon to prepare properly. She listens with real attention, filing away the details you suspect, for some future gathering of her own, the same way you have often borrowed small ideas from evenings you attended at other neighbours' homes over the years. This kind of small, informal exchange happens often along your street, women comparing notes over mailboxes and fences, sharing recipes and small hosting tricks, building up over years a shared informal knowledge of how a proper evening ought to be managed. No one writes any of this down. It simply passes from one household to another through conversations exactly like this one, standing at the edge of a lawn in the cool morning air, comparing notes on last night's success. You mention, in turn, noticing her own gathering from a few weeks back, complimenting the flowers she had arranged along her porch for the occasion, and she brightens slightly at the memory, clearly pleased that her own efforts were noticed and remembered. This is simply how it works among neighbours, you think. This quiet exchange of compliments and observations, everyone keeping half an eye on everyone else's small domestic efforts, offering encouragement in these brief, casual conversations rather than any more formal occasion. The conversation winds down eventually, your neighbour continuing on toward wherever her morning errand was originally taking her, you turning back toward your own front door, carrying with you this small, pleasant confirmation that last night's efforts were visible and appreciated well beyond your own dining room table. It is a small thing, this brief exchange at the mailbox, but it adds its own quiet thread to the larger cumulative sense of satisfaction that has been building since the first guest arrived at your door 2 evenings ago. You glance back once more at your own house as you walk toward the front steps, seeing it now, briefly, the way your neighbour must have seen it the evening before, warm and lit against the darkening street, a small, private world glimpsed only partially from outside. It is a good feeling, you think, stepping back inside, knowing that even this small, unremarkable morning conversation carries within it a quiet echo of the evening's earlier success. Let's pause for a moment on something rarely spoken aloud directly, the long list of small unwritten rules that shaped every decision you made over these past 2 days. Rules you absorbed so thoroughly over the years that you rarely notice yourself following them at all, You think of them now, sitting quietly in your kitchen the day after, turning over in your mind all the small decisions that went into planning this particular evening. The good china is used only for guests, never for family alone, no matter how special the occasion feels within the walls of your own home. The tablecloth must be pressed, never simply straightened by hand. Rolls come from the bakery, never the box, a distinction that matters more than any outsider might guess, carrying with it an entire small code of proper hosting that you learned, piece by piece, from watching your own mother years before you ever hosted an evening of your own. None of these rules exist in any book you've ever read. No one sat you down as a girl and explained them formally, listing each expectation in careful order. Instead, you absorbed them slowly, almost invisibly, through years of watching, helping, and eventually hosting your own gatherings, until the rules became so deeply woven into your own instincts that you no longer experience them as rules at all, simply as the correct and obvious way things are done. You think of the particular order in which courses must be served. The roast never rushed to the table before guests have properly settled with their first drink. Dessert never offered too soon after the main course is finished. Coffee always following rather than accompanying the final course. Each of these small sequences carries its own quiet logic, developed over years of collective practice among women, exactly like yourself, refined gradually into an understanding so widely shared that breaking from it, even slightly, would feel immediately uncomfortably wrong. There are rules, too, about conversation itself, subjects considered appropriate for a dinner table, and subjects better left for quieter, more private exchanges. You think of the careful way conversation moved last night, drifting easily between safe, pleasant topics, steering naturally away from anything that might create discomfort or tension among your guests. This too is something you learned gradually, an instinct for guiding conversation gently, rather than any explicit lesson ever taught to you directly. Your daughter, you realize, is already absorbing these same unwritten rules simply by watching you these past 2 days, learning without being taught exactly which fork accompanies which course, exactly how a proper table ought to be arranged, exactly how a hostess ought to move through her own gathering, attentive but never anxious, warm but never overwhelming. Someday, hosting her own dinners in her own home, she will follow these same rules almost unconsciously, just as you do now, having absorbed them so thoroughly during childhood that she will likely never think to question where they came from. There is something both comforting and slightly strange in this realization. This vast unwritten code governing something as seemingly simple as a dinner party, passed down quietly from mother to daughter across generations without ever needing formal explanation. You wonder briefly how many other small rituals of daily life follow this same quiet pattern, absorbed gradually through observation rather than explicit teaching, until they become simply the natural, obvious way things are done. You glance around your kitchen, thinking of all the small decisions made almost automatically over these past 2 days, each one following some rule you never consciously learned, but nonetheless understood perfectly. It is, you think, a particular kind of knowledge belonging almost entirely to women of your own circle and generation. Quiet, unwritten, but powerfully binding nonetheless, shaping every dinner party, every holiday gathering, every ordinary Sunday supper into something recognizable and proper, connected by invisible threads to countless other tables, set exactly this same way across the whole neighborhood, the whole town, the whole quiet, careful world you have always known. And that was a single evening in 1955, 2 days of quiet preparation, a few hours of laughter and roast and good coffee, and then a house settling back into itself, china returned safely behind glass, curtains hanging still in the lamplight, everything folded gently back into the ordinary rhythm of a life well tended. There was no grand event in what we just walked through. No headline, no history book will ever mention the rolls fetched specially from the bakery, or the tablecloth pressed twice just to be sure, or the quiet satisfaction of a hostess standing alone in her kitchen doorway, simply watching the people she loved enjoy an evening she built for them with her own 2 hands. But that is exactly the point. This was never about grandeur. It was about care, offered quietly, without any expectation of applause. Think for a moment about the woman who spent 2 full days getting ready for a single dinner. She was not performing for anyone beyond her own front door. She simply believed that the people she loved deserved a little extra thought, a little extra warmth, and she gave it freely, the way people did back then, without needing to announce it. So tonight, as you settle in, think about carrying just a small piece of that forward. Maybe it is setting the table properly, just once, for no particular reason at all. Maybe it is simply slowing down long enough to notice the people already sitting across from you. History is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is a percolator humming softly in the next room, and a porch light left on, and someone folding an